Everybody, thank you all so much for sending in your great FOIA suggestions, the draft requests. It's been a lot of fun putting together these materials and looking through the sort of ideas people had and the questions they were asking. And I pulled a bunch of those questions to fuel most of this presentation. But I kind of wanted to quickly recap a few of the core ideas that we'd gone through in the coursework. If you haven't had a chance to fill out the homework and you'd still like feedback on your request, feel free to kind of complete the homework at your leisure anytime before sort of next week, and I'll go through everybody who submitted a draft request and come back with some individualized feedback to you, and I'm always happy to chat more offline. And also looking forward to kind of discussing some requests during this conference call as well. So let me just do a little quick screen share. Great. Okay, so filing your first FOIA. Some of the things we kind of went through were sort of what makes a good request. And you know, there's a lot of things you've heard over the years, and sort of a lot of times people are looking for sort of magic language. What we found is that clearly defined requests that really define what you're asking for, and that the agency can understand what you're looking for, and if at all possible, providing evidence that that document actually exists, is going to be way more successful than any sort of magic keywords or any kind of magic language that you can find. One of the things, I think I included this in one of the emails, but sometimes people pass around 3, 5, 10-page FOIA templates and they say, hey, this is going to scare agencies into submission or that sort of thing. Typically that backfires because then they're not actually sure what you're asking for. So here's just a few of the basics that we found make a good request. Clearly defined, let them know what you're looking for. Set date parameters wherever it makes sense. So if you're asking for emails or other kind of permits or something that's created on a rolling basis, let them know about the time period you actually care about. Now, when it comes to data or something that's digital, that date parameter can be really wide, but including that up front usually saves you a step. Tips on who might have that document and how you can find it. Again, agencies, even relatively small agencies, are kind of really complex, bureaucratic, and a lot of times really still paper-driven in an extent that's surprising to people on the outside. So anytime you can help that agency say, hey, Steve over in county might have this document, or I saw the mayor mention this at a press conference on this date, that goes a long way towards in helping them actually figure out and locate what the document is you're asking for. I mentioned this previously, but a study found that requests with hyperlinks in them tend to work a lot better. Documents and tend to get responded to more quickly. That's not because hyperlinks are magical. It's just because having a link kind of shows that agency evidence that this document actually exists. Explaining your status. This was one of the things I was really glad to see in most of the draft requests for workshopping that were included. People explained, I'm a reporter. Sometimes people gave a little bit of the context around the story they're working on. That goes a long way towards eliminating fee issues and making sure your request gets treated with the seriousness that it deserves. You don't need to go into a whole lot of detail, and you definitely don't need to kind of explain the background of why you're asking for these documents. You have a right to them, full stop. But the more that you're comfortable explaining, the more that you can kind of detail that this is a journalistic project, makes it easier for the agency to A, put you in the proper fee category or waive fees where appropriate, and B, sometimes offer sort of alternatives. They might say, oh, what you're asking for is this, that's going to take a long time for us to pull, and we're not actually sure it'll answer your question, but we can also give you this, which would be much quicker and probably more fully answer your question. So if you have a good working relationship, providing more information to the agency can often help out. Not every time, and it's case by case, but just something to think about. And then getting creative. Sometimes, you know, one of the big questions I get a lot is sort of how do you make a request more specific? Sort of if you can come up with the name of the document. We looked at a few techniques for going on Document Cloud, going on to agencies' websites, trying to figure out form names. One of my favorite request suggestions that was kind of put in there was sort of asking for permits and policies, and we'll go workshop that request a little bit later. But any kind of metadata or background information you can pull in advance and kind of have handy is going to be a lot more useful when you're actually going for documents you care about. I was talking with a reporter a few months ago, and every time they start covering a new city, they have a list of like 10 or 20 just sort of background requests that they file to various different agencies. They want the personnel list. They want, the new employee training manual. They get all these requests, and that does a couple things. It kind of lets that new agency know that people are going to be requesting documents, and sometimes those requests are going to be really routine, and so they don't need to freak out about them. But then that reporter also has a lot of really good background information. So then if they're investigating sort of turnover within an agency, they have that sort of original personnel roster. They can ask for an updated personnel roster, and they know that document exists. And so it's a lot harder for an agency to claim they don't know what you're talking about if they've previously given it to you. One of the other things I saw in almost all the draft requests that got submitted, people cited the law. Not required in every state, but always recommended is citing the law. Remembering not to ask general questions. I think the draft submissions were really good there. We see agencies a lot of times say, hey, I don't have to answer this. This is a question. You can only ask for documents. So just very basic, but something to keep in mind. And then including enough detail just for them to locate that information. Just as important as what to include, what not to include. We've kind of run through a lot of this. One of the things I would really kind of encourage people not to, I saw this in a few drafts, but including extraneous arguments or kind of background. If it's not going to help them actually find the documents, make sure that you're not kind of making a justification for like, I think this is going to, this person is corrupt. I need these documents to show how corrupt they are. The time to kind of outline those allegations is in your article or in talking with that source. Just make sure that you're kind of treat this as a bureaucratic process so that they kind of understand exactly what they're looking for and they don't get kind of distracted by sort of broader arguments about what's the story and what's the not. And then also just kind of a reminder that there's a human on the other side of this process. By and large, the people processing FOIA requests and public records requests, usually fairly low-level employees, usually people who have a lot of different hats and are kind of overworked, underpaid for what they do, a relatable kind of position for a lot of journalists. And so just keep in mind that that person is going to be more likely to try to help you out. They're going to be more likely to kind of offer you a piece of advice that is going to get you the document you want if you kind of keep in mind that they're kind of between two different sides and kind of stuck in the middle of a process that is usually not a lot of fun for them. Just kind of wanted to talk through a few creative requests we've seen. One of my favorites is if you work at a large corporation, you probably have some sort of like internal homepage or intranet page. Some of the requests we've seen have asked agencies for, I want a copy of your agency intranet homepage and every page linked to it, which is fascinating in kind of like a weird voyeuristic way. Kind of see like, okay, what do people at Homeland Security see first thing when they log in? But it can also give you really good ideas for other requests you can file in the future, or even story ideas. There's been a few times where people ask for like internal newsletters, and then you see that, this agency is having people be extra vigilant for fraud. Maybe there's a recent fraud case at this agency. Oh, this agency's newsletter mentioned that there's a recent virus outbreak. That could be a good news story. Vehicle inventories, data manuals, data inventories. One of my favorite requests of all times was there's a reporter waiting at the Registry of Motor Vehicles, the Department of Motor Vehicles, to get their license renewed. And they noticed at this DMV that to fill out the forms, they had to pay 10 cents for a pencil from the DMV just to get that form filled out. And there was a little sticker on the little pencil dispenser that said, all proceeds from this pencil dispenser go to pay a scholarship fund, like the Little Jimmy Scholarship Fund or whatever it was. And so that person filed a FOIA request for information on the DMV's scholarship fund. And it turns out they hadn't actually paid a scholarship in 10 years. But they still had this pencil policy that annoyed everybody. just because it became a little slush fund. And they were able to get a little story out of that. Now, not groundbreaking corruption or anything, but a lot of times it's just noticing little stickers, noticing little permits can kind of spark creative ideas that can lead to pretty good stories. And eventually that is a story that led to change. They switched to pens a few weeks after that story came out. So journalism having an impact. Here's a few of the other creative requests we've seen. Agency recycling guides. So we got, for example, the NSA's guide, internal guide to recycling. Agencies love putting together like the dumbest sort of internal messaging posters, and that can be a lot of fun to look at. And it's also kind of gives you an idea of sort of what's the priorities for that agency. Reveal recently had a really great story where they dug into a lot of how national parks and other sort of agencies were changing their messaging around climate change under the Trump administration versus the Obama administration. And it was really fascinating kind of see like internal talking points, internal guides to sort of public messaging around climate change. And because they're able to get the before and after, they're able to tell a really compelling story. FOIA log requests. So people, your public records requests are themselves public records. So other people can request those, and you can request, hey, I want to know all the public records requests that this agency received last year. And that can give you ideas for things to think about. One of the really neat things is that most records requesters are actually commercial entities. So insurance companies, hedge funds, small businesses. In a lot of towns, dog walkers are one of the most frequent public records requesters because they ask for the dog registration data so that they know where to try and drum up new business. So by asking for public records request logs, asking for FOIA logs and looking through them, you can get some really good ideas to start requesting stuff that never would have even occurred to you to ask for. And then ticket databases. Every time the seasons change, there's other opportunities for fascinating public records requests. One researcher we were talking with filed a request, the city arborist in one town, they asked for their database of all the trees that the city owned and then the type of tree. And then knowing the location of the tree and the type of the tree, they're able to make this beautiful foliage map come fall to kind of see, okay, if you're really looking for red, yellow trees, this is the time to do it. This is the best part of the neighborhood. Snow ticket databases. So if you're one of those towns unfortunately hit by really bad storms, you can kind of go figure out who hasn't been properly shoveling the sidewalk by asking for citation data of everybody who got a ticket for not shoveling their snow. So we oftentimes think of public records requests as kind of this deep investigative skill. And a lot of times, if you look at investigative reporting, it is a very valuable part of that. But you can tell all sorts of lifestyle stories, all sorts of stories that kind of really shed new light on the communities that aren't necessarily bringing anybody down, but kind of helping us look at data, looking at other information in a new light. And that can be really valuable. So just take a moment as you're kind of filling out forms when you're at the DMV, when you're kind of looking in line and you see like a little government sticker that says this agency was inspected by X. If your town has been recently implemented a new like plastic bag ban, as a lot of towns are doing, always an interesting request to see, has the city actually fined anybody for not following that plastic bag ban? And just trying to think through, how is the government gathering data on this issue? Or if I have to fill out this paperwork or file a tax, what kind of data is that feeding? And that could be some really, really interesting results. And then also with public records requests, one of the pieces of advice is always kind of try to take off your reporter hat as much an extent as possible and think sort of, what would a middle manager do, right? So think through what kind of processes are put in place, what kind of documentation is put in place to make this policy happen, what were the planning documents involved, and sort of trying to think through, okay, the story you care about is X. The way to get information about that story is to think through sort of like, okay, if I were implementing this policy, if I were responding to this issue, here's how I'd approach it, and here's all the paperwork that would exist. Other things kind of involved in sort of that thinking like a bureaucrat. Assuming your document request is going to get passed around. This is particularly true about federal Freedom of Information Act requests, but it's also true at the local level. It's amazing how often requests bounce around between 2, 3 people. At the Department of Defense, they said the average Freedom of Information Act request touched 12 different people. And at the DoD, a lot of times people have, something can sit on a desk for 2 weeks, 3 weeks before they even take the first look at it. So anything you can do to kind of minimize the hops and get it going to the right person is going to help it speed up. And then also, respectfully, politely, but kind of being the squeaky wheel can go a long way towards saying, hey, I just wanted to check. You said this request is going to be ready tomorrow. Just want to make sure it's on track. And if there's anything we need to do to speed up the process, let me know. Question we get a lot is sort of, should I talk to a FOIA agency or a public records requester, public records officer about my request on the phone? Generally speaking, I would say yes. Now, I've been in circumstances where agencies have been very aggressive and creative and pretty persuasive about convincing me to withdraw a request before I even knew what was going on. So what we think about is try to avoid committing to something that you're not comfortable with. And then most importantly, always putting whatever resolution you came to in writing at the end of the call. So take that phone call. A lot of times public records officers or Freedom of Information Act officers can come up with really helpful suggestions in terms of, hey, you asked for this database, but I think what actually would be more helpful for you is this. And they're willing to say things over the phone that won't get them in trouble with their colleagues, but might actually get you what you care about a little bit more quickly. Now, one of the things that I also really recommend is if you get a rejection or if you're kind of going after something you're a little bit uncertain about, taking the time to kind of research particular issues, particular exemptions, can go a long, long way. And it's amazing how often I've seen fights with local agencies in particular, but even federal agencies where they just don't want to have to deal with processing a request. And so they'll kind of make up an exemption or they'll misapply an exemption, and a little bit of research you take that back to them and they back down pretty quickly. Is anybody from New Jersey? One of my favorite rejections of all time is we had an intern who was a dolphin washed up on the side of New Jersey and it was put down. And so they asked for a copy of the dolphin autopsy. And then the state of New Jersey rejected that request, saying that releasing that autopsy would violate the dolphin's medical privacy rights. Privacy rights no longer apply once you are deceased, and they don't apply if you're a dolphin. So they doubly don't apply if you're a dead dolphin. We pointed this out, we went back and forth, and then it turns out that the contractor that does the dolphin autopsies had just gotten a lot of negative attention from Greenpeace. And so they told the state, you either find a way to stop complying with these public records requests or we're not going to do these autopsies for you anymore. So doing a little bit of research can go a long way. We have a database of each state's laws and sort of a plain English explanation of them all at muckrock.com/place. The Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press has a really fantastic resource called the Open Government Guide. If you Google RCFP OGG, it'll come up. Really, those two are pretty comprehensive resources in terms of state laws. And then if you're running into a federal issue, FOIA.wiki is a collaborative resource that has detailed explanations of each federal exemption and sort of when they're applied, when they're improperly applied. Finally, one other resource that I'd really like to recommend is if you're running into issues at the local or state level, most states have a open government coalition. If you go to national FOIC.org, they have a lot of resources for state and local organizations that a lot of times those organizations are looking for more people to help out. They don't get a whole lot of cold calls, so they usually have a hotline or email address. You can say, hey, this agency is rejecting, or hey, I'm trying to figure out, is there a lawyer I can talk to about this? And they usually have a lot of free, readily available resources to kind of help you push back on agencies. So We have a few great questions from folks and a few requests to workshop, but I kind of wanted to take a second and see if there's any specific questions about any of that material so far that you didn't get to put into your questions for later. Yeah.
Hey, I heard you mention that you could FOIA FOIAs that the agency had received from other. Can you also specify like the outcome of the FOIA? Like, I'd like to have all rejected FOIAs, or I'd like to FOIA all rejected FOIAs, or all accepted FOIAs. Would that be, or like
Yeah.
get the status of the FOIA along with the actual FOIA?
Yeah, that's a really good request. And short answer is yes. But I think a lot of times the strategy that's going to work best depends on how they store that data. Every federal agency keeps a kind of basically a spreadsheet of all the requests they've received, a short summary of them, and then their final outcome or current status. And so usually they just want to hand over that spreadsheet. But we've done requests say, I want all copies of all appeals for fee waiver requests at a certain federal agency, as well as any final determinations for those appeals. And that was a request where we got back a lot of valuable documents. So you can get creative with that. I would just kind of keep in mind that sometimes it's going to be a quicker response if you just say, I want the whole spreadsheet versus just the rejections. And usually agencies are happy to kind of chat through how they store that information because they want to do less work. Any other questions? Okay, great. We'll come back for more time for more questions in a bit later. But so somebody was asking, they had sort of a question where they were looking for just kind of an answer to this. Is there a limit that city council members can spend on monthly expenses, right? And I think this is such a great sort of background request to file. And this comes down to sort of figuring out sort of what policy documentation is that agency going to have. And this is the kind of request that you might not have a current story you're investigating, but you're just kind of, hey, it's Friday, I want to file a new FOIA request. And so this is one where you kind of have to take that question and kind of reverse engineer it into sort of what's a document request around that. Now, city council members in most jurisdictions kind of revolve on sort of a semi-regular basis. You know, a lot of people do stay in those positions for a long time, but one thing you can ask for is, I want a copy of the city council's ethics guidebook. You can ask for any orientation materials, including ethics guidebooks or kind of other guidelines that are provided to new city council members. And so just started thinking through, okay, as a city council member would become involved in the city council, what are the materials that would kind of, they would receive that would answer this question? And the great thing about that is if you are working on a current story about sort of monthly expense limits, then if you ask for sort of orientation materials, or if you're asking for sort of all city council ethics guidelines and expense reporting documentation, that's not necessarily going to sort of start turning on any alarms. And that seems like a fairly innocuous request where they realize they'll look more ridiculous rejecting the request than just providing you those documents. So this is a really good area to request on no matter which city you're in. And that should be a fairly straightforward request. I would just sort of say, I would like a copy of any guidance given to city council members regarding their expense reimbursement policies. A couple people had questions about tactics for getting emails or requesting people's emails. This is a really tricky one. So the problem is a lot of agencies are using really ancient email technology still at this point. It's gotten a little bit better, but I think one of the first things to kind of figure out is sort of like, how bad is their email system? How challenging is it to for them to kind of do searches? For example, up until a few years ago, a lot of federal agencies, their retention policy for email was about 30 days. And then after that, they had to print out any email that they wanted preserved for the long term. And those emails literally got filed away as paper and they destroyed all the digital copies. The last few years, the federal government has fortunately revised that policy. And so things are a lot better, but still pretty bad, particularly compared to the corporate world. So when you're looking at local level, one of the things I really recommend for emails is trying to put together a list of sort of who would the senders of those emails be that you care about, who would the recipients of those emails be that you care about, and then trying to figure out a few keyword terms to kind of ask them to search for. I want emails that include the following list of any of the following list of keywords. And then putting a date range of probably just a week or two whenever possible. If there's something that's really important and you do a broader look, that's definitely, you're right. But what we found is that if you can kind of keep it narrowly scoped to a few weeks, a few named participants, and a set of keywords, agencies are much less likely to put up a major fight or try to hit you with large fees. The problem is, and this is going to vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but fees can really rack up because a lot of times they end up going back to those employees themselves. There are a few places that do centralized email search for FOIA requests and public records requests, but at the local level, usually they go to the employee and they say, okay, Joe Smith, please search your email on these dates for these keywords. And so that's another thing to keep in mind is that you're asking the employees themselves to do those searches. And so if you're working on a story, that person will probably be tipped off to your records request. And so keep that in mind with the strategy. But generally speaking, I found that if you can provide a time window of about 2 weeks or less, and keywords and a few specific names of people, and sometimes that might just be the sender, and then they'll search that sender's inbox with those keywords. But the more of those that you can include, the less likely they're going to be able to come back to you and charge high fees or just say that this search is way too broad. Does anybody have specific questions about emails? I know that's something that comes up a whole lot. Okay, great. Somebody asked about FBI files. Oh, was there a question?
Michael, I was going to ask what format. I mean, what format do you ask for, and what format do you often see emails provided in?
That's a really good question. We always ask for documents in their original electronic format. We find that includes sort of the most metadata that, you know, leaves the least kind of amount for games. Usually what we do is we get them back as paper, or on a good day, a searchable PDF. Now, the problem is for a lot of agencies, people include, hey, call me on my personal cell phone number, and then they'll include their personal cell phone number in the email. Or there'll be other sensitive data in an email that needs to get redacted. And agencies just generally don't have the training or software to properly redact emails in their original format. And so what they'll do is they'll print them out, redact them, and then maybe scan them back in, or maybe just mail you a bunch of emails. And that gets really tricky, particularly for larger emails. That's a really good question. We have started seeing more agencies provide PST files and that sort of thing. And there's various tools for kind of analyzing those. Sometimes that can be a headache, but we are starting to see more original formatting, but particularly at the local level, the redaction, if there's any sensitive information mixed in, it's going to be a real challenge for agencies to deal with. Speaking of that, one other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times agencies have, I'm not going to say purposely done this, but we have noticed a lot that agencies will come back and say, oh, there's 1,000 emails that match this keyword term. Some things to think about as you're negotiating with agencies are making sure that you're not getting back a bunch of like copies of Google alerts, especially if you're paying 10, 20 cents an email, asking for a sample of those. And if they say, hey, this is going to be $5,000 for these emails, saying, okay, I'll pay you for 20 bucks worth of emails just so you can get a sense of what's in there, can be a really worthwhile investment, because there's been a lot of times where emails will include a bunch of automated alerts or newsletters or Google alerts that you don't really care about, because that's all public information to begin with in the first place. So one thing to think about is sort of like what else could be filling up that inbox and increasing the fees that the agency is asking you to pay for. Somebody had a question about FBI files for famous people. The basic rules around FBI files and kind of getting those via the Freedom of Information Act are fairly simple. Generally speaking, if that person is deceased, you can include an obituary and file a request with the FBI saying, hi, I'd like the FBI files on this person. They were born on this date. They died on this date. Attached just a copy of their obituary. And the FBI is actually pretty good at processing those requests, often on a pretty good timeline. If you're asking for the FBI files of a living person, usually Privacy Act comes into play, and you're not going to get much, if anything. You can ask for a copy of any open source materials in this person's FBI file, and then sometimes the FBI will provide news clippings and other sort of already public information. But it's really, really hard to get the FBI files of living people, and it's really easy to get the FBI files of dead people. One strategy that can be really helpful here, however, is if you care about somebody who's part of an organization, or if you care about a living person who's part of a group, groups and organizations do not have privacy rights for the most part. So, for example, you could ask for a copy of the FBI files on a certain band, and you'd get back files. They'd redact the names, but it's usually pretty easy to figure out who they're talking about. And you wouldn't get those same files if you had asked for the FBI files of the individual members of the band. So that's true with organizations, rallies, that sort of thing. So sometimes you can go a little bit orthogonally when you're going after FBI files and get back much better results than if you just ask for person X's FBI files. There's a really good question. How can freelancers make this process manageable in terms of managing and juggling public records requests, and then also presumably in terms of kind of fighting with agencies over the process? So we run MuckRock as a service that kind of helps manage and organize requests. We also run a free site called FOIA Machine that is, you can just kind of track your updates in there. But really, it's coming up with one system and kind of sticking with it. And I think if you're not going to use one of the more advanced solutions like MuckRock or FOIA Machine, calendars and sort of email programs that allow you to kind of set yourself reminders can be super, super helpful. So there's a service called Boomerang that I know a lot of FOIA requesters use that you can say, hey, remind me about this email in 2 weeks or something like that. And that way you're kind of getting reminders of like, oh, I asked for this information from this agency a week ago, 2 weeks ago. It's probably about time to follow up on that. So I think kind of just sticking with the process when it comes to logistics or remembering to follow up and keep track of your requests can be really helpful. And then I always advise keeping as much of that process in email as possible. We send out a lot of letters here to agencies that prefer that, but I think the great thing about email is you have a copy, they have a copy, and it's much easier to kind of follow up on and that sort of thing. The other thing I would say for freelancers is to take advantage of the legal resources that are out there. There's a lot of legal clinics, there's a lot of nonprofit groups that are really focused on legal issues when it comes to the Public Records and Freedom of Information Act process. And particularly if somebody's a freelancer with like a good, exciting case, there's a lot of lawyers who are looking for that. The truth is, over the last few years, there's been fewer people bringing lawsuits at the state and local level, and particularly if that's the kind of fight you're interested in, or if you're tackling some really interesting federal material. A lot of lawyers can win back their attorney's fees if they win a lawsuit. And so that makes them much more willing to take on free or pro bono public records and Freedom of Information Act litigation. Some good resources for that, again, NFOIC, RCFP, Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, has a FOIA hotline where they can try to connect you with lawyers who'd be interested in representing that case. And then there's a lot of legal clinics. So if I would look around your state and sort of figure out what are the big legal clinics in your state and sort of saying, hey, I've got this case. These are the documents I'm fighting for. And a lot of times you can get some really great pro bono assistance that'll help take some of that off your plate and help get some really big wins. So we had a pro bono lawyer 2 years ago. We paid for the court filing fees, and that was it. And then we ended up winning a lawsuit that got us 13 million pages out of the CIA. And really our investment was a few $100 to pay the federal filing fees, and then the lawyer did most of the work. Really fantastic lawyer, and we've kind of got this really amazing trove material. So I think on the one side, organization, and on the other side, just taking advantage of all the resources out there. I talk with a lot of state coalition organizations, state free information organizations, and they're all always just asking for, hey, we'd like to find more cases. We'd like to file more lawsuits on behalf of people. So there's a lot of people out there that want to help out. Also, we have a free online community of FOIA requesters. So if you're ever looking for quick advice, muckrock.com/Slack is where you sign up. And there's a bunch of huge FOIA nerds, including myself in there. Always happy to kind of talk about questions or help workshop requests. Okay, so somebody else submitted this request to workshop, and so I thought this would be a pretty good place to start with. So this is a pretty good request, and I've seen a bunch of people who've done some really great reportings going after state department, state level arrest level. So state police arrest data can be really fascinating data. And it's hard to tell with this if this request is going to be successful, but I think this is a really good starting point for asking for this information. Some things I really like about this: they cite the law, including the exact section. I think it's always nice to cite the exact section because it just, usually what happens, it'll land on somebody's desk, and if something has a legal code in it, they just sort of mentally take it a little more seriously. It's a little bit of a friendly fear tactic. They're pretty defined. I think there's a nice date range here, which I think is really good. Documents to present. So I think one way to do a good date range around documents, just sort of pick a date in the past and then say to present if you don't want to miss any recent documents. So that's a really good strategy being displayed here. Now, the big question with this one, and I think the area is sort of, how do they actually store this data? Do they have an electronic database with this data? Has somebody at the state level mentioned this database before? So, and then sort of being careful about sort of when you're using terms like the race of the person who received this request. One thing I would just kind of keep in mind is that agencies love to be hyper literal about requests. Sometimes we kind of talk about agencies as being like that kind of cursed genie who will misinterpret your request any way they possibly can. And so maybe on that ticket it says ethnicity, or maybe it has some other kind of terminology on those requests and tickets. So I think just kind of keeping in mind sort of if you have a copy of the citation that the agency releases, that's really helpful to go forward to refer back to in a case like this and make sure you include that same information. One other thing that I'd suggest modifying on this request, any and all records related tickets issued for not wearing a records request. Generally speaking, I recommend trying to avoid the phrase any and all records or any and all data because that's kind of super broad, and I think agencies tend to balk at that because then if they comply with something and then they're like, well, did they consider this related to this document? So I would include this instead to be a little more specific in terms of a copy of any databases, logs, or other inventories of tickets issued to motorists for not, or to motorcyclists for not wearing a helmet on these dates. If any databases include the race of the person who received the ticket and the age of the person, I would like to make sure I include you include those fields when you prepare that database for me, or something so that it's sort of not asking for any and all documents, but sort of asking for the database, which I think the requester cares most about in this case, Maybe you also are asking for sort of any data entry instructions just to kind of see if there's any caveats based on that. And just kind of using this as the starting point of a negotiation with the agency over those records. Because maybe they start a new database every year. A lot of agencies will have 2018 database, they'll have a 2017 database. And so in this case, maybe you'll end up getting 2018, 2017, 2018, and maybe that's what you'll be able to get because 2019 just started and it's probably not worth fighting over. So I think, again, just kind of making sure, like reworking this phrasing so that it's clearly about a specific database or any specific databases they have. And then kind of incorporating and making clear that I'm particularly interested in these fields of that database, any recorded race or ethnicity of that that is recorded in this database, any data age or date of birth that's recorded in that database, and then figuring out a way to word it so that it's total arrests, any documentation regarding the total arrests. Sometimes what I like to do is kind of provide them an out and sort of say, hey, I would like a copy of your database listing every single ticket you've issued. If you can produce a copy of the database that only includes tickets issued for not wearing a helmet, that'll suffice. So like make it a broader, more comprehensive, but harder to argue with request, and then offer sort of a simpler, easier to do request as an alternative to that. And sometimes that's a way you can get them to answer questions as well, by sort of saying, hey, this is what I'm asking for. This is what I'm legally entitled to. If it saves you time to just kind of give me a database of the number of arrests and the average age, I'll take that instead, and kind of figuring out, giving them a little carrot stick incentive there. This states that they want the request electronically. Very, very good. Yeah, and then sort of asking them to cite any specific exemptions is really important. So in general, I thought this was a really well-written request. One thing that can be sometimes helpful in requests like this is to point to previous times where they've released similar data. And sometimes that's just reminding them that they have in the past and that they're legally allowed to. And then sometimes that's helpful for them just kind of figuring out who internally is in charge of this. What I found is most people sort of on like the front lines of receiving public records requests do not have good computer training, oftentimes don't really understand how email works. And so by kind of pointing to prior releases or prior examples in that vein, they kind of know who to go to internally. But yeah, I thought this was a really good request. Okay. So this was a request, training materials and handbooks. So I like this request. So, and this also kind of goes back to, something a little bit on the last one, but that was mostly just about that one database. Multi-part requests, I think can be really useful. But I think one of the things we've found with agencies is that if you ask for 4 or 5 things in one request, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll answer 2 or 3 of your questions and then just kind of ignore the other ones. That usually just means you have to go back and yell at them, but keeping requests as simple and sort of accessible to the agency so that they're not confused about it can be helpful. But I think this was a pretty good specific request. Just trying to think what other feedback do I have here? Yeah, I mean, I think this is really, really good request here. It kind of is asking for specific things here. It's given a date range for these two. For this one, I would say sort of, I'd either include a date range or kind of include language that says any training materials that are kind of under active use. One of the things that we found with sort of training materials, handbooks, memos, is that sometimes agencies will want to say this is copywritten material. it's important to remember when it comes time to fight for these requests, that copyright is generally not an exemption to a public records law. So just because maybe they had a third party put together like a training video or something like that, they still have to hand over that training video if it's considered a government record. Just because it's copywritten by somebody else or even copywritten by that agency is not an automatic exemption. That might mean that you can't republish that as the requester. For example, we got the Obama administration backing tracks, which was a bunch of really great John Williams music. And they said, we'll provide this to you as the requester, but just a heads up, if you ever publish this, then John Williams can come after you. So we don't want John Williams to come after us. So we never published that information. But just keep in mind that, just because something is created by a third party or something like that doesn't necessarily mean it's exempt. But I think this is good, pretty good request overall here. I would also, most states don't have any sort of fee waiver, clear fee waiver guidelines, unfortunately. At the federal level, it's almost always really easy to get out of fees. Most states don't have similar provisions, so just something to keep in mind. But what we've found is that both state and federal level, over 95% of requests don't have fees, so it's usually not that big of an issue. I do like language that kind of says upfront, I'm willing to pay fees as long as it's under this. That can often save you a step in the process, so that's really good to have in there. So this was another request submitted for workshopping. Yeah, so I think this is another really good request. It kind of joins together logically associated information, which is good. So you're asking for a very specific application. You're including sort of a specific date, but you're also saying that it might or might not have been on that date. So yeah, I thought this was a really, really good request. Love seeing if you can get the awards number. That's always super helpful, particularly with federal agencies. But I think even state and local agencies, a lot of times they're kind of stuck in their own world and sort of think through things. So doesn't get to be much more specific or kind of request than that. One thing I would say about this request, I would kind of this language, I think this is a great request up here. I don't think you need to kind of go through and do too much more justification around this, because you're asking for the specific materials. You've kind of outlined that you're a media requester. I don't think you need to go into too much detail in terms of what the story you're seeing, right? I think my request is seeking out why the government awarded her more than $1 million in the first place. I think that's a really good story. I think if anything, that kind of like raises more alarms with the agency, and sometimes just by kind of like not making your request stand out, it seems more routine. For example, a lot of federal agencies now, if there's a request that they think are going to be newsworthy, they kick them up to the political appointees for they say just a heads up, but in some practices is actually slowing down the requests or giving them extra scrutiny. And so I think kind of getting rid of this and just asking them to go through their contract database and provide this, and stating that you're a media requester, is going to be a much more smooth process. But I thought this was a really nice specific request that, I think kind of outlines specific dates. Love seeing the award number. A few months ago, I put together an article on sort of looking up federal contract numbers, and I can send that around afterwards, because I think anytime you have evidence like that, it makes it a lot harder for the agency to say, I don't know what you're talking about or something like that. So really good request. I would just cut out that background information, because I think right here, like it's going to be the same process for them to pull this contract either way, and mention that there's a fraud investigation. That might make the person be like, oh, should we check if there's an ongoing investigation or something here, and kind of actually raise other objections to that request. Here's a fun Super Bowl related request to kind of end on. Somebody asked, so there's these helicopters that are looking for natural occurring radiation in Atlanta. How much these cost tests, right? So I think in generally speaking, there's a few fun ways to kind of tackle this request. Anytime money changes hands, that's usually a really good time to kind of file a public records request, because everybody kind of agrees how taxpayer dollars are being spent is a good opportunity to for public oversight of that expenditure. So asking for those contracts, asking for those flight logs. Usually the government does contract out stuff like that. But I think you can ask for budgets and that sort of thing related to that flight. And this is another occurrence where you definitely want to include a link so they know exactly which flights you're talking about. So if you saw like a news article about this flight or something like that, asking for any contracts, for third parties to do this helicopter flyover, or any proposals or budgets for that project. I think you could capture both external and internal expenditures covering that material. So thank you to everybody who sent in workshop questions and requests to workshop. And again, if you did get a chance to kind of submit a request or I didn't review it, please feel free to submit that third homework assignment and I'll provide individualized advice. But yeah, other final questions.
I was curious how I came up against something recently where I needed to, I didn't know the complete structure of a database that I was trying to request, or even that one really existed, but there was some evidence that maybe there was a database. So would you just be link to the thing that you have and then say, I would like the database behind this report? Is that a legitimate way?
I think including citations and saying, I'd like a copy of whatever database or spreadsheets were used to do this analysis. I think that's perfectly valid. One thing I've found can be helpful when going after databases is sort of filing the initial request and saying, pushing in particular to kind of find time to talk with their data team in terms of how that can be exported. Again, public records officers a lot of times aren't sort of the domain experts in SQL queries or even Excel spreadsheets. And so a lot of agencies are willing to kind of put together kind of conference calls where it's you, the PIO or public records officer, and the person who actually has the data to kind of talk through how it can be exported and what format they can get it to you. So there's a question. Good question. I've heard recently there have been instances where agencies have sued people making records requests. What are the ways freelancers and/or journalists can avoid this? So we have kind of reverse FOIA cases. Try and find some links that are useful here. For the most part, mostly those are kind of procedural cases where they're just suing you and the agency to block the release of those records. Once an agency gives you the records, they don't have any legal grounds to stop you from doing any reporting on them. What are ways that freelancers and journalists can avoid this? I've seen this in Washington State and California, and there's probably a few other states where reverse FOIA cases happen. What can you do to avoid that? I haven't seen anybody have to pay major fees after a reverse FOIA case. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. And so if you're worried about that, I think usually kind of what they want to do is just stop the request in the first place. And so if you get into a situation where you're seeing a reverse FOIA, usually it's easy to get out of by just dropping the case. But also there's usually a lot of groups that are interested in kind of taking on those cases and helping push back against them, especially in cases of reverse FOIA. I know there's RCFP is really interested in this. A lot of the state First Amendment coalitions are really interested in this. And there's some other legal groups that are interested in this. I don't really know how to tell you to avoid that. A few times that we've been caught in reverse FOIA cases, it's kind of like you never know what's going to set it off. At that point, it was asking for information about electric meters, and I never would have guessed that would be like a 6-month-long legal battle. But we ended up not having to pay any fees. We didn't pay court costs or anything like that. So I'll see if I can follow up with a link on reverse FOIA so you can see a little bit more about that. Other questions? Great. Well, thank you everybody for putting in the questions and workshopping the requests. I know that's it can be tough to subject your request to public scrutiny, but I really do appreciate those people who shared, and I hope this was valuable for everybody kind of going through and learning. And I'm always happy to chat FOIA, and yeah, I really had a good time doing this workshop.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for doing this and bringing this to office hours. We'll pass the resources on to the email list when we're done here. Yeah, thanks all for coming.
Great. Have a good weekend.
Yeah. See ya.